All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 11, Section 4, the Mexican-American War, 1846 through 1848. So let's recall real quick. Actually, let me get my right color here. 11.3 was all about Texas, and specifically Texas independence. And when Texas broke away from Mexico, the question was, will it become part of the United States? And there was an annexation controversy in which Texas stood as the Lone Star Republic for approximately 10 years. That question about Texas being added to the United States would be answered by James K. Polk, who was a president, became president of the U.S., and was an avid expansionist. So if you remember anything about Polk, it is that his position was expansion and that he wanted to achieve manifest destiny as president. And this was, manifest destiny was for the U.S. to stretch from Atlantic to Pacific, right? So to go from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast to make sure that U.S. territory expands greatly. And when he became president, he very aggressively pursued Oregon, this territory that you see here in the map. Oregon, or the Oregon Territory, was a territory that was contested essentially by Great Britain and the United States. However, via treaty with Great Britain, the United States eventually did end up with this Oregon territory here, which became the states of Oregon and Washington. So via treaty, the U.S. acquired Oregon, making this idea of manifest destiny essentially one step closer. But even after Oregon, that wasn't the only piece of territory that the United States had its eyes on, I should say. Texas was, of course, a big debate at the time whether or not that should be part of the U.S. Northerners said no, Southerners said yes. But another one was California. And in fact, Polk had offered to purchase California from Mexico. But the U.S. relation was so poor at the time, given what had happened in Texas, that Mexico just outright rejected any offer by the United States to purchase land from it. And so that only led to an increase in tension. The real thing that really created the downfall between the U.S. and Mexico relation, though, was when President Polk made the decision to annex Texas. And the idea was for the United States anyways, that Northerners would be appeased by adding Oregon, and so adding Texas as a slave state, given that Oregon was likely going to be free territory, that this could kind of counterbalance those reservations. And so in 1845/46, Texas became not just a slave state in the United States, but became the largest slave state in the U.S. Right, in the U.S. So that just added one more strike against the relationship between Mexico and the U.S. Because remember, the Mexican government didn't fully recognize Texan independence. General Santa Anna was forced to sign a treaty recognizing an independent Texas, but the Mexican government did not do that. You also have the fact the United States are assisting Californios. Those are people in California seeking independence from Mexico. All right, so the U.S. is encouraging a separatist movement here, a secessionist movement. And so when you add all these things together, right, the strikes against the relationship between the United States and Mexico, which up until this time, the two countries had, their relationship wasn't bad, right? But really, Texas independence was strike one, right? Because a lot of the Anglo influence. The fact that the United States then went to annex or add Texas was strike 2, and the fact that the United States was assisting separatists in California, which was part of Mexico at the time, was strike 3. And those strikes led ultimately to a war with Mexico. Even though all those things soured the relationship, fundamentally the issue was disputed lands. As you can see here, the United States insisted that the border between Texas and Mexico was right here. Mexico insisted that no, that this was the border. And so essentially this land here, the U.S. said that it belonged to them. Mexico said that it belonged to them as well. And so what President Polk did was sent U.S. troops into this disputed territory. Those troops were fired upon and killed. The war cry in the U.S. In the U.S. was that American blood was shed upon American soil, that Mexican forces shot and killed American forces on U.S. territory, which from the perspective of the United States was true, but from the perspective of Mexico, this was territory that belonged to them. And that ultimately led Congress to passing a declaration of war against Mexico. Now, some in the North rejected this premise, right? Northerners especially. But Abraham Lincoln, who was only a congressman at the time, right, would later on become the most important president in all of American history. But at this time, he was a Northern congressman. He put forward the Spot Resolution, which really challenged the war with Mexico. He believed that the beginning of this war, the origins of this war, were much more cynical. This was the idea that was held by most Northerners. Northerners pretty much said this: war is going to equal land, and land is going to equal slavery. And so for Northerners, this war with Mexico meant exactly an expansion of slavery. And those like Lincoln in the North who were, opposed to this, tried to prevent this war from happening by coming out against it. The Spot Resolution was essentially Lincoln saying, show me the spot on the ground where American blood was spilled, essentially not believing it to be the legitimate cause of the war. Not a lot of support. Abraham Lincoln was voted out of office in the next election cycle. So not a lot of people willing to stand up for this particular position 20 years later when he's elected president, or less than that, 10 years later or so. The rest of the country has come around essentially to where he stands on this issue. So not a lot of support for challenging the war. And just like that, the United States, goes all at it. The outcome of the war was never really in question. The United States more or less won every single battle. A lot of that was thanks to industry. The United States had better guns, better transport. You can think of it as, Mexico was not really an industrial nation, so they didn't have the ability to mass produce a lot of the supplies that were required. And the war was fought pretty much in 3 areas. General Zachary Taylor fought essentially in what was essentially in Texas or northern Mexico. He used superior weapons. He also gained a reputation from being a war hero. In this case, he was very much like Washington and Jackson, and that he would go from war hero later on to become a president. So he got kind of the share of the spotlight from this conflict. And again, like pretty much all the other American generals, won every single battle. His nickname was Old Rough and Ready. General Stephen Kearny was responsible for American military actions in California, including capturing San Francisco, which then went into U.S. hands. General Winfield Scott was responsible for the invasion of Mexico and was responsible for capturing the city of Veracruz, as well as Mexico City, which was the capital of Mexico. And so again, on the battlefield, the U.S. practically won essentially every battle in this war. And so the question about whether or not the U.S. was going to win was never really a question to begin with. Rather, it was what was going to happen after the United States won. And one of the questions was how much land, right? How much land exactly is the United States going to end up with? Again, Northerners, very suspicious that more land equals more slavery. So they're looking at this, of course, as these events transpire, seeking to try to limit the amount of territory the United States wants to bring in, whereas Southerners want to see, a lot of territory brought in. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War. So this ends the Mexican-American War. Right, only fought for a brief 2 years, which included a huge land grant called the Mexican Cession, which included California, Arizona, and New Mexico, which, among other territories, also became part of the United States. So the Mexican Cession is California, Arizona, New Mexico. These territories now belong to the United States. Mexican Cession right there. Those people who were living there were granted U.S. citizenship. So they went from being Mexican citizens to U.S. citizens if they chose. Many actually stayed in the U.S. Some left and went across the border to Mexico to remain Mexican citizens. However, mestizos, which are mixed blood, and Catholics, who of course are different in terms of religion, and those who spoke Spanish, were not always treated fairly by the U.S. government. Especially there was some reservation about, this question about how much land should be offered. You simply just had some straight out individuals who were racist that said, look, we don't want to add all of Mexico, which there were calls for. There were calls to add all of Mexican territory. Because a lot of people lived there were Catholic, they were mestizo or mixed blood, or they spoke Spanish. And so that was one of the motivating factors that limited the Mexican Cession to eventually what it was, which was just California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, some of those areas on Colorado. Now, of course, the big question for the U.S., if you've been paying attention in the other chapters, you could probably guess, right? Now that California, Arizona, and New Mexico are part of the United States, and I'm going to draw this in a different color here to really put the point home, is the next question, of course, is what is the status of slavery in these territories? And that becomes the big, big question. That was the question in Missouri. That was the question in Texas. That was the question for many of these other people who wanted to see slave power expanded or at least limited. And for the time being, again, recall that before a territory becomes a state, it requires a certain population. And in the meantime, the population in these areas, California, New Mexico, and Arizona, remained very, very low. So you could essentially take this question about slavery and procrastinate it. You could kick the can down the road. It didn't need to be answered right now. That was until the gold rush. And in 1848, gold was discovered in California. There was a mass exodus of tens to hundreds of thousands of people who moved to California in hope of striking it rich. They were called 49ers. So the people who went to Cali and the name comes from the year 1849. That was the year after gold was discovered. So in 1849, tens of thousands of people rushed to California in hopes of trying to find gold. Now, initially, many of those who went in search of gold were looking for and did find to a small degree placer gold, which is just kind of gold that you see on the surface. It's gold that you sift for in the river. But most of the money was actually made by mining companies and corporations that utilize things like hydraulic mining. The mass immigration of individuals, which included a lot of Anglos from the eastern coast of the U.S., but also included people from Asia. A lot of Chinese came to California looking for gold. It included people like from South America that came to California. It had a very negative impact on the Indians or Native American population. There were high levels of abuse and really the Native American population being taken advantage of. Chinese immigrants also were not welcome in these areas. The governments that were set up by Anglos, that is the English-speaking Protestant population, passed certain laws. So, for example, in places like California, Chinese miners had to pay an additional tax, whereas Anglo miners did not. And so that was just one example. Here you see an advertisement of gold being discovered, or at least a travel advertisement to get there by steamship. There's a ship, this is titled The Way They Go to California in Search of Striking It Rich. And here you see a political cartoon that was created. I'll scroll down. A political cartoon that was created that showed some of the prejudice against the Chinese population who had this type of what they called a Q haircut. And so that was experienced by that population there. Now, this gold rush led to the creation of boom towns. These were cities which populated very rapidly. San Francisco is one example. This is a photo of San Francisco in 1851. It turned into, thanks to the gold rush, San Francisco turned essentially into a major city practically overnight and became very, very important to the Western economy. But most important for us, and I'm going to go back here to this color of red here, is that what the gold rush did was that it made California ready for statehood. And so this question about the Mexican cession, about whether or not slavery would be legal in the territory acquired through the Mexican-American War, that question would now have to be answered rather than being able to procrastinate or kick that can down the road.